Hello and welcome to the Rodgers Brief. I'm Adam Rodgers, and today I'm going to be reading from part 2 of Deficits of Trust, which is my ebook, a report on the mass casualty commission proceedings and, of course, the events of the mass casualty. So this section is dealing with the events themselves and what we've learned from the mass casualty commission and from other sources. So this is what really happened. In this section, I will outline and review what we know about the events of April 18th, 19th, 2020. Much of this information comes from the MCC investigations, but there are other important sources as well. I have attempted to organize the details in a cohesive narrative covering what happened and what could have happened instead if police had made better decisions as events unfolded. One of the MCC lawyers, former senior legal aid lawyer Roger Burrell, started the evidentiary portion of the MCC by making a presentation based on the Portapique April 18, 19, 2020 foundational document. This is a 91-page summary prepared by the Commission that covers the first hour or so of the killing spree up to the time when the shooter was able to escape Portapique. Generally, Mr. Burrell seemed to be fair about how he characterized what was known and what conclusions have been made by inference. Where there were some precise time frames available thanks to telephone records or timestamps on photographs, that was stated. When the narrative was relying on witness statements and observations and would thus necessarily be less reliable, that was noted as well. There were several 911 phone calls made that night which would give the police a clear understanding that the shooter was Gabriel Wortman and that he was driving a replica RCMP vehicle. Crucially, the evidence identifies a particular point where the killer was nearly within sight of the police and could have been pursued within the community. He was not, and was eventually able to escape Portapique using a Blueberry Field road, the existence of which would have been known to local residents, but not the police. Lisa Banfield's account of the early moments. Lisa Banfield spent 19 years with Gabriel Wortman before he went on a rampage and killed 22 people over the course of 13 hours on April 18th, 19th, 2020. It is difficult to know what to make of Miss Banfield. She spoke to the police the morning of April 19, 2020, after claiming to have spent over 7 hours in the woods, which is a long time to be able to think about what you might tell the police when you emerge, and was able to provide some helpful information in those early moments. This early account also had the effect of persuading the police that she was a completely innocent party. Doubts about parts of her account would later arise, but never to the extent that her central narrative was meaningfully questioned by anyone in an official capacity. After those early days, Miss Banfield seemed to disappear. She never gave an interview to any members of the media and seemed to be using every means at her disposal to avoid answering questions. There was considerable doubt, seemingly fostered by her legal team, whether she would even testify at the MCC. She did eventually testify. When that happened, it was after having had 2 years to prepare her answers, considerable preparation time and help from her high-profile lawyer, and the benefit of knowing everyone else's version of events before having to give evidence. She was also spared the burden of facing potentially unpredictable cross-examination questions. On the other hand, multiple other witnesses have confirmed her accounts of having been the victim of domestic violence over an extended period of time. On yet another hand, she had no children to protect and seemed to be enjoying a very comfortable lifestyle built on criminal activity of which she must have been well aware. She now has a clear financial interest in denying knowledge of those criminal activities as she tries to retain entitlement to Gabriel Wortman's $1 million-plus estate. Miss Banfield's account of the initial moments of her spouse's shooting rampage has been mainly consistent from the first time she told it in the morning of April 19, 2020. She claims that after a day of driving around, including on some of the back roads that Wortman would use to evade the police the next day, and talking about their 19th anniversary, things started going badly during a FaceTime call going on between her and Wortman and a friend from Maine, Angel Patterson. This call ended badly with Miss Banfield being, seemingly irrationally, upset over a comment made by her friend on the other end of the call, saying something negative, perhaps jokingly, about a 20-year relationship committal ceremony idea Wortman and Banfield had been discussing. The MCC was not able to verify that this call even took place, though that would seem to be a simple thing to do. They have also not called Miss Patterson to give evidence, despite her being the last person with whom Wortman spoke before going on his killing spree. Questions on this point have been vaguely answered in the past 2 years plus, citing lack of cooperation by the witnesses and the FBI. Now that the hearings are complete, it is stunning that this conversation was not verified, nor the content established and studied more by the MCC. Miss Banfield says she left the warehouse and went back to the main house through a path in the woods. She says she was already regretting her reaction to the comment and so returned to the warehouse to attempt to reconcile with Wortman. While Miss Banfield was having a reflective change of heart, Wortman was evidently drinking more and working himself up into a fit of anger. They argued, and she says she turned around and went back to the house to go to bed. Wortman followed her back soon thereafter. When he arrived back, she says he pulled her out of bed, threw her to the floor, and began pouring gasoline all over the house. She says he forced her outside at gunpoint and took her sneakers when she tried to flee. One of these was later found by police. She says she also threw a jacket into the woods, but this was not recovered by police. He forced her ahead of him back to the warehouse. He put handcuffs on her, but for some reason only on one hand. She says she was later able to remove this handcuff. There were handcuffs recovered from the mock police cruiser while in the back seat of Wortman's mock cruiser. Incidentally, when Miss Banfield testified, she indicated that she had scars from the handcuffs, but did not show them on camera, nor was she asked to do so, and there was no medical information provided on that specific injury. He locked her in the back seat of the replica cruiser, the back doors of which could not be opened from the inside. Wortman then threw some guns on the front seat and went to the apartment section of the warehouse, out of sight of the mock cruiser. Miss Banfield says she then managed to escape the car by squeezing through the silent patrolman plexiglass divider between the back and front seats. Evidently, the silent patrolman and the car doors are very silent, or else the warehouse was so large that the noise of her escape did not reach Wortman, who seems to have been getting changed in the next room. She decided not to take any of the guns that were laying on the front seat of the car. No real analysis of this portion of Miss Banfield's story has taken place. So far as has been made public, there has not even been a measurement of the silent patrolman opening taken. The burned-out mock cruiser was available for analysis after the shootings, but we never learned sufficient details about the silent patrolman to know whether this part of her story was even plausible in a physical sense. After she escaped the replica police cruiser, Miss Banfield says she ran into the woods. She says that she first went to an old truck, which did not belong to Wortman, that was parked in the woods nearby. She says it was full of tools and that when she got in, the dome light came on. She says that this potential visibility caused her concern, but there was something else that she let slip briefly in one of her statements that drew my attention. She said she was worried because if Wortman saw the truck, quote, then maybe he would blow that up, close quote. This sounded to me like she was referencing a grenade, which Wortman was suspected of having smuggled and hid on his property. It was perhaps a glimpse into what Miss Banfield really knew about Wortman's smuggling activities. She has otherwise denied any real knowledge of specific details of this key element of Wortman's ability to access firearms. There are many problems with the statements taken from Miss Banfield by the police, which I will discuss later when I get into the MCC itself and some of the legal machinations and negotiations that must have been taking place behind the scenes. Among the many things the police did wrong during these events was to improperly question Miss Banfield. As I will review later, this gave her the kind of leverage she needed to avoid or resolve criminal charges of any kind, and also to avoid cross-examination at the MCC. She did, however, provide multiple statements to the police and even more to MCC investigators. What struck me from the initial police interviews conducted in the days following the killings was the absence of any sense of the magnitude of what had taken place. She was giving long answers about people in Portapique that she did not trust or like, focused almost entirely on her own escape story, and had no real personal reaction when asked about anyone who was killed. An unknowing reader, if they were asked to read her statements and guess what crimes had been committed by this lady's spouse, they might have guessed he would be charged with unlawful confinement and possibly arson. I thought this might have been an aberration on her part, generated perhaps by the shock of events, but then, in her lawyer's closing submissions at the end of the MCC, the first statement was that Miss Banfield had instructed her lawyer to thank her sisters and other supporters for helping her, and to thank the MCC for their trauma-informed approach. That is, she was thinking first of herself and not those who her spouse had killed. In her statements and in her testimony, Miss Banfield's account of her time in the woods, when she could hear sounds consistent with some of the other testimony we heard from officers on the scene, only seems to cover the first hour or perhaps hour and a half of these 7+ hours she spent alone in the woods, and then the final 15 minutes or so when she went to Leon Jodry's house at 6:30 a.m. The area near where Miss Banfield claims to have been hiding was quite busy throughout the night. There were vehicles passing by as they evacuated the community. The Police Immediate Action Rapid Deployment (IARD) team was on foot in the area. A second team came to the Macaulay home to rescue the children. The Emergency Response Team (ERT) showed up in their TAV vehicle and traveled up and down the road adjacent to Miss Banfield's hiding spot. In the morning, one of the ERT team members put a heat-sensing drone in the air near where she was hiding. It did not see her, and she testified that she did not see it. None of these noises or lights were clearly identified by Miss Banfield in her testimony, and she did not discuss why she did not have the confidence to come out of the woods and be rescued many hours earlier than she did. As it was, she says she crawled out of the woods, crossed a road, and made her way to Mr. Jodry's home, which was north of the warehouse, between the Blairs and the Galenchans, though Mr. Jodry's driveways were slightly to the east, on Orchard Crescent, not Orchard Beach Drive. The questioning of Miss Banfield was led by Gillian Nattau from the MCC. I was somewhat surprised that lead MCC counsel Emily Hill was not the lawyer chosen to question Miss Banfield, given her importance and the consequent pressure to get her questioning right. I doubt that Miss Hill would have done anything differently than Miss Nattau, but this struck me at the time like a team putting their backup goalie or third-string pitcher into a big game in case things do not go well and an excuse is needed. One of the first things noted by Commissioner Fitch was that no questions would be asked about Miss Banfield helping acquire ammunition for Wortman. The reason given was that the criminal proceedings against Miss Banfield on charges of supplying ammunition to Wortman have not yet concluded, and part of the MCC mandate is not to interfere with other proceedings. It was strange that 4 months after Miss Banfield's charges were referred to restorative justice, the process had not been completed. Most often, 3 months are given by the court to complete a restorative justice process, and that is usually plenty of time. Considering the high profile and public interest in this particular case, it bred suspicion that this process had not yet been completed, so as to allow Miss Banfield to speak more freely during her testimony. Many of Miss Banfield's answers during her MCC testimony were very short, and she denied knowledge of anything that might have been incriminating or which would generate further questions. We did not learn much of anything new from Miss Banfield's testimony. Very early in her testimony, she downplayed any knowledge of the people in and around Portapique, suggesting that Wortman would spend days and weeks up at their cottage while she remained in Dartmouth. She denied really knowing about Lisa Macaulay, for example, though statements and emails between the two suggest that they had direct run-ins over Miss Macaulay's dogs, and that she was aware that Wortman and Miss Macaulay had a short affair. She also denied knowing much of anything about Wortman putting together the pieces of his mock police cruiser, and specifically denied ever driving in it or knowing of Wortman ever driving it, though she also described him having it outside to wash it, and the manager of the Halifax Mercedes dealership adamantly stated that Wortman dropped her off to the dealership in the fully marked version of the car. There was no sense from Miss Banfield that she had any concern about the potential danger of Wortman having a mock cruiser in his possession, despite his propensity for violence and his access to an arsenal of guns and police uniforms and badges. She simply denied that she thought he would do anything like that. As to the events, Miss Banfield was not asked very many questions so as to avoid making her re-experience the trauma of them. No questions were asked about Miss Banfield's restorative justice commitments and whether testifying here was one of them. As one of the participants' lawyers noted in a media interview, it may actually have been less traumatic for Miss Banfield to testify one time in a more fulsome manner, rather than doing 4 police and 5 MCC interviews about the events. She seems to have overheard the shooting of Corey Ellison from her hiding place in the woods, hearing voices and shots consistent with what we know of that shooting, but did not then hear the ERT armored truck drive down the road to call out to Clinton Ellison, who must have been hiding nearby in the woods, from which he was rescued. Amazingly, but not surprisingly, Miss Natal finished her questioning of Miss Banfield after about 3 hours. This was arguably the most important witness of these proceedings, and yet many of the other witnesses, and even some of the panel discussions, have gone longer. Miss Banfield became emotional at times, thinking back to the violence she suffered and of how the thought that Wortman was looking for her while killing others haunts her. Her lawyer provided a report from Dr. Peter Jaffe, a domestic violence expert from Ontario, of how she has suffered, though Miss Banfield did say she is aware that others have suffered much more. Miss Banfield's testimony will not satisfy many, I expect. She gave short answers for the most part, seemingly in an effort to protect her legal position in the ongoing civil proceedings over Wortman's estate. To my eye, she did not display much emotional depth or empathy for others. Crucially, she did not seem to have any real insight into why her spouse of 19 years suddenly went on a killing spree, why he left her alive, or why he chose particular targets. She did not give much of an attempt to explain why she did so little in the face of Wortman's inherently dangerous ownership of a car and paraphernalia that would allow him to impersonate a police officer. She gave no insight into how Wortman was able to smuggle guns across the U.S.-Canada border. She did not give a compelling explanation as to why she did not come out of the woods much earlier than 6:30 a.m. on April 19, 2020. There will be those who excuse all of that, given Miss Banfield's status as a victim of Gabriel Wortman. For those not already inclined to provide blanket understanding and forgiveness to victims of domestic violence, Miss Banfield has likely not changed many minds. If one of her restorative justice commitments was to provide testimony during the MCC, she fulfilled that, but certainly did so in a minimal fashion. Some speculation had it that Miss Banfield may have gone with Wortman to Debert overnight and been dropped back off in the morning. Note that Mr. Jodry's home is fairly near the Blueberry Field Road, which, as of the morning of the 19th, had still not been examined. That would explain the gap in her account of the overnight hours, her moderate, considering the cold weather, degree of hypothermia, and also the small slippers that were found in Debert. There is no video evidence, however, that Wortman's car ever came back to Portapique or that vehicles owned by others were used for such a purpose. Another part of her story that initially seemed suspicious but now I see as less so is her claim that she hid in a cavity created by a large tree. The tree story seemed suspect to me after having visited Portapique and noticing that though the forest was thick, all the individual trees were very small in diameter. It would have been extremely difficult to find one's way around the woods in the dark, and extremely unlikely to find a large tree capable of providing any measure of shelter. Corporal Dwayne Ivany is a medically trained officer who attended at Portapique and later at Hunter's Road, where Heather O'Brien was killed. He treated Miss Banfield when she called police at 6:30 a.m. on April 19, 2020, and observed that her skin was pale, she had blue lips, and her teeth were chattering. On cross-examination, he agreed that he had not mentioned the chattering teeth in his earlier statement, that the ambulance report did not mention anything about hypothermia, and that he did not check her hands to see if there was any evidence of her having escaped from handcuffs. MCC evidence of Portapique killings. The MCC has attempted to put together what Wortman was doing during these initial 45-60 minutes based on when 911 calls were received, noises heard in the background of calls, and witness accounts. This is not completely free of problems or questions, but from what we know, we can reconstruct a fairly clear account of what happened in Portapique between the time Miss Banfield ran away from the warehouse and when Wortman evaded the police and escaped the area. First, there was a 10:01 p.m. 911 call from Jamie Blair from across the road and to the left of Wortman's warehouse, telling the operator that her husband Greg had been shot. She also told the 911 operator other key details, such as the name of the gunman and that he was driving a fully decaled RCMP car. So, it would seem that once Miss Banfield went into hiding in the woods, Wortman presumed. He then got into the mock cruiser and went looking for her. He killed Greg Blair outside on the deck, killed the family dog and cat, and then hunted Jamie Blair inside the house, killing her inside the same bedroom where her two sons, aged 11 and 9, were hiding. There was nothing overheard on the 911 call to tell us whether Wortman was asking about Miss Banfield, and nothing from the two surviving young boys gives any indication that he was yelling out for her to come out if she was there. In fact, Wortman was either unaware of or indifferent to the two young boys in the house who were hiding just feet away from where their mother was killed. Wortman did not seem to take much time to search the residence. Instead, he took some burning logs out of the fire and left them on the floor to burn, setting fire to the Blair home. There was about 10 minutes of time between when Wortman left the Blair home and when he killed Lisa McCauley at the edge of her driveway next door. The MCC provided two alternate possible timelines at this stage of events. In one version, they had him going south to Cobequid Court and killing the Bonds and Tuck Oliver crew before returning to Lisa McCauley's home. This would seem to require both a set plan and considerable efficiency of movement on the part of Wortman. The more likely scenario is that he looked around the area of the warehouse and Blair residence for Miss Banfield before going to the McCauley home, which was next door to the Blairs and directly across the road from the warehouse. The two Blair children, in the meantime, ran next door through a path in the woods rather than going up on the road to the McCauley home. They did not see Miss McCauley outside. GPS data from her phone shows her outside her home at 10:13 p.m. Lisa McCauley was a well-regarded teacher and a single mother to two children aged 10 and 12. She had previously been in what seemed to be a fairly casual but sexual relationship with Wortman. We learned about some of this from the statement of Leon Jodry, who also briefly dated Miss McCauley, as well as from emails between Miss Banfield and Miss McCauley, which were disclosed during the MCC process. Miss McCauley's home was also the home owned for a time by Glenn Wortman, the killer's uncle. Wortman had tried to swindle his uncle, who had needed Wortman's help to finance the property. After having been paid off, Wortman refused to take his name off the property as an owner, and litigation ensued. It has been theorized that Wortman coveted the property and misdirected his animosity towards Miss McCauley as a result. While property issues seem to have manifested themselves in other aspects of the killing spree, this part does not seem any more complicated than Wortman looking for Miss Banfield in the early moments after her escape. Who had not previously heard or read any of the reports of the 911 call made by the McCauley and Blair children, the poise and courage which they displayed while in close proximity to the killer and under impossibly difficult circumstances was simply remarkable. After leaving Miss McCauley's home, Wortman's next certain location was at the home of Frank and Dawn Galenchen at 10:25 p.m. This is a known time since Andrew and Kate McDonald were driving by, saw the police car, were shot at by Wortman, and called 911 at that time. The Glenchen home is north of the Blair-McCully warehouse area, back towards the main road. Before going to that home, the MCC theorizes that Wortman went south towards the water to Cobequid Court and the homes of Peter and Joy Bond, as well as Aaron Tuck, his partner Jolene Oliver, and Tuck's daughter Emily. If one imagines that Wortman was still just looking for Miss Banfield, it does not seem sensible that he would go so far south to these homes at that time. The Glenchen home is about half the distance away from the warehouse, and Miss Banfield says she had complimented it before to Wortman. Perhaps he, not unreasonably, surmised she would go there, if she was not at the Blair or McCully home. The issue is that the MCC has two other times certain, and the Cobequid Court killings do not neatly fit in with the known bookends. There is also no known motivation for either set of killings presented at the MCC, though Wortman had evidently tried to buy the Tuck property and had had a run-in with Aaron Tuck over some work Tuck had done. The first bookend is Emily Tuck's text messages with a friend. She last sent a text at 10:03 p.m., so there is no plausible scenario where Wortman started his killing spree at Cobequid Court. The Blair 911 call happened at 10:01 p.m. Miss McCully's phone has her outside at 10:13 p.m. Wortman seemed to have spent a few minutes at each of those locations. He shot at Andrew and Kate McDonald at 10:25 p.m., after which he drove left from Portapique Beach Drive and went south on Portapique Beach Road, which does not connect with Cobequid Court, and most likely drove past his own home and killed John Zoll and Joanne Thomas and set fire to their home at 10:30-10:35 p.m. He shot Corey Ellison near the warehouse at 10:40 p.m., as confirmed by timestamps on Ellison's cell camera photos and contemporaneous radio broadcasts of gunfire by the officers who were then on scene, and passed by the Wilson's Gas Bar in Great Village, an approximately 5-minute drive away from Portapique, at 10:51 p.m. So, the Cobequid Court killings could conceivably have happened during two of those windows of time, between Miss McCully's and the Glenchens, or else between Corey Ellison and his exit from Portapique. It seems more likely that it would have taken place during this latter time frame. Wortman left by the Blueberry Field Road, which is adjacent to Cobequid Court, on the southeastern corner of Portapique. Earlier, after he had killed Miss McCully, he was likely still looking for Miss Banfield in that area, perhaps spending a few minutes inspecting the wooded area around those homes and the warehouse before going to the Glenchens. Wortman had his replica police car in the driveway of the Glenchen home, where he was observed by Andrew and Kate McDonald, residents of Portapique who had noticed some indications of the chaotic scene in their community. They were parked on Orchard Beach Road, next to the Glenchen home, when Wortman pulled up next to them in his mock cruiser. Wortman shot at the McDonalds, grazing Andrew's shoulder. Andrew hit the gas and took off towards the main road. Wortman followed him, and driving behind him was David Faulkner. The McDonalds got to the intersection of Orchard Beach Drive and Portapique Beach Road and took a right towards the main road, Highway No. 2, encountering Constable Stuart Basselt and Constable Vicky Colford about halfway between the intersection and the highway. Interestingly, Wortman did not pursue the McDonalds beyond the intersection, but instead turned left down Portapique Beach Road. Leaving them alive was risky, from his perspective, if he had other plans in mind to carry out. They had seen him and would be able to blow his cover if they were able to make a call to the police. The other possibility was that Wortman knew the police were stationed there near the highway. The only way he would have known that would be if he had access to police radio communications. This possibility has been examined by the MCC, which concluded that he may have had access during some of the overnight hours, but not at this early stage, with the use of a Motorola police radio that was discovered in the mock cruiser. Unfortunately, it was in such a burned-out state that the MCC investigators were unable to conclusively say what capabilities it may have had. The three RCMP officers who initially responded to the original 911 calls were Constable Stuart Basselt, Constable Adam Merchant, and Constable Aaron Patton. Together, they described their reactions to getting the initial messages shortly after 10 p.m. on April 18, 2020, their first steps down Portapique Beach Road, and their mindset and actions over the next several hours as they dealt with the active shooter situation in the community. I am personally familiar with two of the first three officers on the scene, Stuart Basselt and Adam Merchant. Constable Basselt was stationed in Port Hawkesbury and Constable Merchant was in Antigonish. Both are big men over 6 feet, with Constable Basselt probably closer to 6'5". I handled criminal files where they were involved and found them both to be diligent in their reports and fair in their actions. Constable Basselt played in our men's hockey league as well and was a tough, aggressive competitor on the ice. You could tell something about a person by the way they play hockey, and I would have had a hard time believing he did not want to take an active, aggressive approach to this situation, dangerous though it would certainly have appeared at the time. The evidence from the MCC confirms that Constable Basselt, Constable Merchant, and Constable Patton behaved bravely, searching for the active shooter on foot, cutting through the pitch-black woods towards the sound of gunfire, and checking on the Blair McCulley children several times. Constable Basselt also thought, at 11:16 p.m., to recommend to the commanding officer that the public be alerted to what was happening. Despite some initial questions as to whether the 911 call may have been a mental health call, which appears to be quite common for RCMP officers to have to address, and some natural incredulity about the nature and scale of the threat, it is clear from the officers' testimony that they took the call seriously. They drove from their various positions around Colchester County to the scene as fast as their police vehicles could take them. Upon their arrival, Constable Basselt spoke with shooting victim Andrew MacDonald, who he also knew from playing hockey, and learned that there was an active shooter and some details about the shooter's identity. The officers, who were wearing 70 pounds of body armor and other gear, ran down Portapique Beach Road in search of the shooter. The officers described that their IARD training for such active shooter situations told them they should not be in their vehicles, as that would make them sitting ducks for any potential ambush. This moment is one of the potential turning points in the shooting rampage. Had the RCMP officers who dealt with the McDonalds jumped in their cars and sped south along Portapique Beach Road, they would have caught up with Wortman while he was at the Zoll Thomas residence. While the officers were running south, Wortman was driving past his own home, which was engulfed in flames at this stage, and towards the Zoll Thomas home. This home was at the southern point of a private trail that led through the wooded area between the two main roads in the community, with the northern end coming out at Wortman's warehouse. If he was still looking for her, he may have speculated that Miss Banfield went south on that trail after having not found her in the first three homes he searched. The officers appeared to have followed their IARD training, and knowing what they knew at the time, it does not seem unreasonable that they made the decision to employ it. They had an active shooter who was very familiar with the territory and could have ambushed an officer should they have approached in their police vehicles. Nevertheless, this is a key decision which had major consequences. Had the officers gone down Portapique Beach Road after Wortman in vehicles, they likely would have caught him in the act of killing John Zoll and Joanne Thomas, or else seen his car going through the trail from next to the Zoll Thomas property back to his warehouse. Perhaps somewhat curiously, Wortman did not look to the Griffin home, which was next to the Zoll Thomas residence. The Griffins did later report sounds of gunfire at their neighbor's home and called 911 when they saw that it was on fire. The Griffin's son, Peter, appears to have been a criminal associate of Wortman, having among other things provided Wortman with the decals that he was able to apply to the decommissioned RCMP car to make it look authentic. Perhaps Wortman, correctly, guessed that Miss Banfield would not try to take refuge there. After leaving the Zoll Thomas home, Wortman drove back to his warehouse through the trail. This trail seems designed for trucks and ATVs, but was capable of being traversed by a car with the clearance of a police cruiser. It would seem that Wortman had abandoned his idea of Miss Banfield having gone down that trail and decided to return to the warehouse area to see if she was there. This may have been a risky move on his part, as there would have been police officers or firefighters on scene when he returned. There could have been. If he had the ability to monitor radio communications, however, he would have known the coast was still clear. If he had a working radio, Wortman would also have known that the IR team was running down Portapique Beach Road, approaching his position. Whereas the road had no other exit, the best way to avoid the police would be to go through the trail. Brothers Corey and Clinton Ellison had walked up towards the warehouse after noticing it was on fire. They had been visiting their father Richard, who lived south of the warehouse. Clinton returned to the home before reaching the warehouse, but Corey continued on, took a few pictures with his phone, encountered Wortman, and was shot and killed by him. Based on their accounts, it would seem likely that the three IR'd officers, as well as Lisa Banfield, all heard these gunshots. There would have been no specific motive for Wortman to kill Ellison other than to keep him from reporting any details of Wortman's whereabouts and disguise. Ellison was just unfortunate to be there. DNA of Corey Ellison was found on the killer's boots. There had been some speculation that Mr. Ellison may have been accidentally shot by an officer in the confusion of the search, but this evidence would certainly run counter to that theory. The officers described how they followed the sounds of gunfire and other explosions, came across houses on fire, dealt with the children who were hiding in the McCulley home, and ran through the woods using unmarked trails. Constable Patton discovered after the fact, when he looked at the data from his fitness tracker watch, that they had traveled about 10 kilometers on foot over their time in Portapique. Procedurally, I thought the use of a witness panel for these officers worked well. It allowed the three officers to draw on their collective memory and for us to get a sense of how the dynamics of the team may have manifested itself during these critical hours. They appeared to function well in that regard, with Constable Basselt as the clear leader. The fact that none of the participants' lawyers had objected to the three sitting as a panel led me to expect there would not be dramatic revelations or particularly difficult questioning of these witnesses. Had there been significant evidentiary holes which the participants were looking to explore with these witnesses, they likely would have insisted on questioning the officers separately. A key issue that arose during the testimony was that of individualized GPS units for officers. RCMP police cars are tracked with GPS units, but individual officers are not once they get out of the car. We found out, however, during cross-examination questioning from Rob Pinio, that in fact each officer's radio has built-in GPS capabilities. Certainly that would seem to be a valuable resource for the police to use, and one which would allow supervising officers at headquarters to be much more use in coordinating a response. As it was, Constable Basselt said that he was not expecting to receive much help from anyone other than the two other officers with him. Constable Basselt also testified about his comment at 11:16 p.m. that perhaps an emergency alert of some kind should be sent out to the public. Constable Merchant was asked about emergency alerts and noted that he did not know much about how they worked and that was not a constable decision. Among the things we are learning is that perhaps it should be a decision that can be made by an officer of any rank who is on the scene and is aware of an active shooter situation. The military-like hierarchy of the RCMP did not serve it well when it came to warning the public. Among the first officers on scene, it was clear who was leading. Beyond that level, there was a degree of confusion and overlap that seemed to get in the way. A second wave of officers showed up and were asked to be given something to do, wondering whether they should go in and extract the four children. They were not empowered, or did not feel themselves empowered, to act according to what they saw or knew to be the circumstances in front of them. Instead, they had to await instructions from a superior officer who was not on scene. When Constable Basselt asked over the air whether an alert of some kind should be issued, this problem came to a focal point. If it had been his decision, an emergency alert would likely have been issued at that time. He was there and saw how serious the scene before him was presenting. All officers should have the ability to issue an emergency alert to their region in an active shooter scenario or public safety threat. The officer on the scene is in the best position to assess the threat while being provided with investigative information through communication channels. We will have to trust their judgment, but where every second could matter, the trade-off against the risk of a false alarm is worthwhile. Okay, so that's the first part of part 2 of Deficits of Trust, what really happened. We'll continue going through with Wortman escaping Portapique in the next video and the next podcast. So thanks again for listening, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.